There is a room inside Graceland that does not appear on any map. It has never been photographed. It has never been described in any authorized document, any biography, any estate filing, or any interview given by anyone connected to the property. The tour guides downstairs do not mention it. The archivists who have worked with the estate for years did not know it existed. And for 47 years, it sat at the end of an upstairs hallway in complete silence, exactly as the man who built it left it, waiting for someone with both the access and the courage to finally acknowledge it was there. Riley Keough found it, and when she describes what she found inside that room, and what it reveals about the man her grandfather actually was beneath everything the world thought it knew about him, the effect is not what you expect. It does not feel like a celebrity revelation. It does not feel like the unlocking of a mystery that tabloids and conspiracy theorists have been circling for 5 decades. It feels like grief. Specific, quiet, and completely unresolvable grief for a human being who was so relentlessly consumed by public attention that he had to build a hidden room just to experience 30 minutes of being no one. That is what is upstairs at Graceland. Not scandal. Not secrets designed to shock. Something far more difficult than that. The private evidence of what fame, at its most total and most unrelenting, actually does to the person at the center of it. And Riley Keough, who inherited every inch of that house and every object inside it when her mother Lisa Marie died in 2023, has decided that the world has spent long enough looking at the wrong version of her grandfather. Most people who visit Graceland leave believing they have seen it. They have walked through the jungle room with its carpeted ceiling and carved tiki furniture. They have stood in the trophy building surrounded by gold records and rhinestone jumpsuits. They have passed through the meditation garden and stood at the graves in a silence that feels earned. They have seen the kitchen, the living room, the television room with its 3 screens installed side by side because Elvis wanted to watch multiple channels simultaneously, a detail that tour guides deliver with practiced warmth and visitors receive as charming eccentricity. They leave feeling close to him. That closeness is real, but it is also carefully constructed, and what it conceals is more significant than what it reveals. Because every room on those lower floors was a performance space, not in a cynical sense, but in a structural one. These were rooms where other people were always present, always watching, always being entertained or impressed or accommodated. The jungle room had session musicians in it. The living room had guests. The kitchen had staff. There was not a single room on the ground floor of Graceland where Elvis Presley was ever genuinely alone. The second floor was different. The second floor was the one part of the entire property that existed outside the performance. The place where the audience was not admitted, where the cameras did not follow, where the version of Elvis that nobody was allowed to see actually lived. That is what has been locked since August 16, 1977. And that is what Riley Keough has spent the past 2 years quietly, carefully, and deliberately beginning to describe. What makes Riley's position unlike that of anyone who has ever spoken about Elvis before is not just that she has legal access to the rooms. It is that she has personal access to what those rooms meant, transmitted to her across 3 generations of women who lived inside the gravitational pull of the same loss. Her grandmother Priscilla experienced that loss as a divorced wife navigating the public spectacle of an ex-husband's death while privately processing something far more complicated. Her mother Lisa Marie experienced it as a 9-year-old child who grew up inside a house where the second floor was locked, where the grief was institutional rather than processed, where the absence of her father became physically encoded in a staircase nobody climbed. Lisa Marie spent her entire adult life in a relationship with Graceland that swung between protective devotion and painful distance, never fully resolving either impulse, never finding a way to simply be at peace with what the house held. When she died in January 2023, Riley inherited not just the property, but the accumulated weight of all of that. The unfinished grief, the unresolved questions, the rooms full of things nobody had touched, and the responsibility of deciding, for the first time in the history of the estate, what to do with the parts of the story that had never been told. She went upstairs alone. She spent time in those rooms before she spoke about them publicly. She read things that were not meant to be read and held objects that had not been held since the hands that last touched them were alive. And what she came back with was not a press strategy or a monetization plan. It was a reconstruction, of who Elvis Presley actually was when the show was over and the house was quiet and no one was watching anymore. The room that has stayed with Riley most completely. The one she returns to in conversation more than any other. The one that changed her understanding of her grandfather more profoundly than the letters or the notebooks or the frozen clock above the bed, is the room nobody knew existed. She calls it the quiet room. It sits at the far end of the upstairs hallway, separated from the bedroom by two other spaces, positioned in a part of the floor that even family members rarely reached during their visits to the estate. Elvis designed and built it himself, with input from no one, documented in nothing, mentioned to almost nobody. It is small. The lighting is low and manually controlled, separated from the overhead fixtures in the rest of the hallway by a dedicated switch that Elvis apparently wired independently. The floor is cushioned, not carpeted in the way the jungle room is carpeted, not decorated in any of the theatrical ways that characterize the lower floors, but practically, functionally cushioned, with the specific intention of making the floor a place where a person could sit or lie without discomfort for an extended period. Near the door, positioned to direct its output toward the center of the room, is a sound machine. It produces a continuous ambient hum, a specific frequency Elvis apparently selected because it masked the noise of the house below without being intrusive enough to constitute its own distraction. When Riley entered this room for the first time, she did not know what it was. There was nothing labeling it. There was no note explaining its purpose. She understood what it was only by sitting in it, by experiencing the quality of the silence it produced and recognizing, in that recognition, the specific shape of the need that had created it. Elvis Presley, who had not experienced genuine unobserved solitude in over 2 decades by the time he built that room, had engineered a small interior space where being no one was mechanically possible. The fact that he needed to engineer it, that silence and invisibility were not available to him through any ordinary means and had to be constructed with deliberate architectural intention, is the detail that makes everything else about the upstairs make sense. The study adjacent to the quiet room completes the portrait that the quiet room begins. Riley describes it as small and dark-paneled, lined from floor to ceiling with books that represent the full scope of a private intellectual life that his public image had almost entirely obscured. The volumes cover numerology, Kabbalistic philosophy, Christian theology, Eastern mysticism, Sufi poetry, comparative religion, and the kind of spiritual autobiography written by people who have experienced crises of identity severe enough to require complete reconstruction of their relationship to existence. These were not decorative books. The evidence of how they were used is physically present in every volume. Margins crowded with Elvis's handwriting, passages underlined so repeatedly that the underlining became its own form of commentary, questions written in pencil next to answers attempted in ink below, arguments continued across multiple pages as though the books were conversation partners rather than one-directional texts. The man who owned and used these books was engaged in a serious, sustained, and entirely private inquiry into questions of identity, consciousness, mortality, and meaning that had been ongoing for years and that left almost no trace in any public record of his life. Among the books, Riley found notebooks. Not journals organized by date or structured around coherent narrative, but something rawer and less managed, a mind working through things without an audience, without editing, without any apparent awareness that what it was producing might someday be read. Unfinished song lyrics appear mid-page and dissolve without resolution. Prayers begin in formal language and fracture into something more urgent as they descend. Reflections on loneliness are written with a specificity that makes reading them feel intrusive. And on one page, a full page, nothing else, the word free appears in his handwriting, repeated from the first line to the last, growing larger and more pressured with each repetition until the final instances nearly fill their lines entirely. Riley has described this page more than once in separate conversations. She always pauses before describing it. The question mark, she has noted each time, is not incidental. He was not declaring freedom. He was interrogating whether it existed, whether it had ever been available to him, whether the distance between the life he was living and the life he had imagined was something that could ever be closed. Beneath the bed, beneath silk sheets that have not been changed in 47 years, on a frame that has not been moved, in a room where the clock above the headboard stopped at the exact time paramedics entered and has not been wound since. Riley found a shoebox. 3 words were written on its lid in his handwriting. "Do not open." She opened it. Inside were letters, handwritten on personal stationery in the same hand that filled the notebook margins and crowded the Bible pages on the nightstand to his right. Every letter was unsent, not abandoned mid-composition or left unfinished because time ran out. Written, completed, folded, placed in the box, and stored with 3 words of explicit instruction on the outside. One letter was addressed to Lisa Marie. Riley has declined to describe its contents beyond saying that it was written in a register she had never encountered from him anywhere else. Direct and unguarded and emotionally honest in a way that the performance requirements of his public life had made structurally impossible in any other context. Another letter had no recipient name. It began with a single line that Riley has referenced in multiple conversations and consistently refused to share, saying only that it is a line she has not been able to stop thinking about since the afternoon she first read it. She has not released any of the letters. She has not indicated she will. The shoebox is not a commercial asset in her management of the estate. It is a private object belonging to a private person who communicated his wishes about it clearly enough that honoring those wishes requires no interpretation. What strikes her most about the letters, what she has said changes how she understands his final years more than any other single discovery, is not what they contain, but what their existence reveals about the architecture of his isolation. He was writing to people he loved. He was finding language for things he apparently could not say aloud or in person or through any of the channels that his life theoretically made available to him. And then he was sealing those words in a box and storing them under his bed instead of sending them. That is not the behavior of a man who had adequate means of human connection. That is the behavior of a man for whom genuine connection had become so structurally difficult that writing unsendable letters was the closest available substitute. The tapes are the discovery that Riley has addressed least directly and that may ultimately matter most. Among the uncatalogued materials in the upstairs study, stored without labels, without organizational logic, without any system suggesting they were ever intended for outside ears, there are audio recordings on physical media that have not been fully inventoried or assessed. The archival work is ongoing. What Elvis's final producer Felton Jarvis stated before his own death, that Elvis recorded considerably more than RCA ever released, that private late-night sessions existed that never entered any commercial pipeline, that some of his most emotionally raw and musically unguarded performances happened in rooms with no label presence and no commercial intention, aligns precisely with what Riley has described finding upstairs. Elvis recorded himself throughout his life for reasons that had nothing to do with product. He recorded to hear his own voice played back and evaluate what he was doing. He recorded rough material he was not ready to share. He recorded, sometimes, simply because singing alone in an empty room was one of the last remaining activities that gave him access to something his life had otherwise made unreachable. What is on those specific tapes found upstairs, whether finished songs, abandoned drafts, purely personal recordings, or something that does not fit any existing category, is not yet known even to Riley. The preservation specialists working through the materials are proceeding carefully. Every decision about what eventually reaches the public will be filtered through the same values Riley has applied to every other aspect of the second floor. Not commercial potential, not fan demand, not the enormous and entirely understandable appetite of a culture that has been consuming Elvis Presley for 7 decades without ever fully satisfying itself. But rather, what would he have wanted? And what does actually honoring that look like when the person making the decision is the one person alive with both the authority and the obligation to make it? Riley Keough is 34 years old, and she is managing one of the most complex cultural inheritances in American history with a seriousness and a restraint that are genuinely unusual in the current environment. She has kept the second floor closed. She has turned down filming requests inside private family spaces. She has declined every approach that would reduce what she found upstairs to entertainment content. She is supporting serious archival and educational work that treats Elvis as a subject worthy of genuine scholarly engagement. She is digitizing materials with proper preservation protocols. And she is speaking, carefully, selectively, aware of the weight of every word. about the human being the rooms upstairs contain evidence of, not the icon, not the merchandise, not the legend that has generated billions of dollars across 5 decades of licensing and touring and tribute. The person, the one who needed a hidden room to find 30 minutes of silence. The one who wrote letters to his daughter that he never sent and stored them under his bed with explicit instructions not to open the box. The one who filled an entire page of a private notebook with a single word and a question mark, asking himself the question he apparently could not stop asking, the question that the architecture of his life made permanently unanswerable. Elvis Presley spent 23 years performing the largest version of himself for the largest possible audience. He spent his final years retreating from that performance into rooms above it, searching in books and notebooks and privately recorded tapes and unsent letters for something the performance had taken from him. Riley has not opened those rooms to the world. What she has done is more precise and more meaningful than that. She has opened a window, just wide enough to see through, just long enough to understand, into the life that happened when the audience finally went home.